Police now say that this was definitely a targeted shooting, and they believe the motive could be a grudge against the insurance company. Now, this all occurred in busy Midtown Manhattan on 6th Avenue. Surveillance video shows the moments the violence unfolded, and a warning: this video is disturbing.
Luigi Mangione dropped. Yeah, definitely woo. You're wooing for justice, right?
What is going on? There are dozens of products for sale on Etsy with his face on them. There are look-alike contests. There's Luigi Mangione crypto. People are making fan cams. Do you know what these are?
Let's go ahead and put, C3 up there on the screen. We play some VO of this. People are posting wanted pictures, apparently, all over the city of New York, showing the photos of CEOs of various different healthcare companies.
So this was a while ago. They've actually now taken this post down, according to some random person on Twitter. They said it got to 21,000 laughing reactions before they just took the whole thing down. So basically, everyone who's reacting to this post is doing the LOL.
It is not an unfair comparison to equate the current reaction toward Mangione to the reactions to Robin Hood.
And they're talking about looting, but CNN and Fox News are not going to bring up the insurance companies that are just going to keep everybody's premiums and still give themselves a bonus. Yes! Free Luigi!
Murder is bad. Oh my God.
Wow, brave.
It looks like political violence is a growing trend in America. 2024 ended with the murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. Before that, in 2024, there were 2 assassination attempts on then Republican nominee and now President Donald Trump. In 2025, we have seen attacks on Tesla dealerships and Tesla vehicles due to Elon Musk's association with President Donald Trump. In April, the Pennsylvania governor's mansion was attacked by an arsonist who reportedly sought to beat Governor Josh Shapiro with a hammer. Soon after that, someone set off explosions at a fertility clinic in California. Then 2 Israeli embassy staffers were murdered by a pro-Palestine terrorist in Washington, D.C. After that, another pro-Palestine terrorist threw Molotov cocktails at pro-Israel protesters in Colorado. And now driverless vehicles in Los Angeles are getting set on fire. I guess an attempt to stick it to Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Donald Trump administration. I'm sure many remember the Summer of Love in 2020, where so-called peaceful protesters peacefully protested by smashing and looting small businesses and seizing government buildings. And in the case of Seattle, Washington, taking over a small section of the city and declaring it the City Hall Autonomous Zone, or CHAZ for short, in an effort to show what a community could look like without any dastardly police. After a few weeks, Seattle police would put an end to the CHAZ after reports of teenagers getting shot. At the time, many were at best wishy-washy over the events, with others excusing or outright celebrating the violence. Then the following winter, a bunch of sore losers decided to storm the nation's capital on January 6th, after President Trump lost his re-election efforts. These days, the rioters at the Capitol have no shortage of apologists and defenders. And there are many other stories of political violence over the last decade or so that I have not even mentioned. Alright, so I had the entire first half of this video finished, recorded, edited, ready to go. And then this happened. Some maniac in Minnesota shot and killed Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman along with her husband, and also shot Minnesota State Senator John Hoffman and his wife, both of whom survived the attack. And according to reports, this maniac was planning to kill even more politicians in Minnesota. Even while writing this video, I had to keep adding more and more stories about political violence in America. I have to keep making tweaks to this video because political violence just keeps happening. I mean, can people just chill out for a second? Jeez. Anyway, back to the program. Even dead terrorists are getting praised long after they've been dead. In late 2023, Osama bin Laden trended on TikTok because a bunch of useful idiots found his letter to the American people and found that they agreed with a lot of what Osama bin Laden had to say. I also recall a similar trend happening when the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski died. A handful of trash can political commentators rushed to social media to talk about how Ted Kaczynski had some good points about industrial society. I guess one fan of Ted Kaczynski is Luigi Mangione, who is currently the suspect and being tried for murdering United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. Although Luigi is currently pleading not guilty at the moment, so I guess we'll have to wait and see whether or not Luigi is convicted of murder. It's bad enough that political violence is getting worse in America, but to make matters even worse, many Americans are enjoying this political violence.
Don't you think it's interesting that a situation like this happens and fucking 90% of the reaction is like, yippee!
In the case of Brian Thompson, many are using his murder and the insane reaction to the murder to talk about how people are upset with the system.
The billionaires run it all, is they get the opportunity to squeeze every last penny.
Yeah.
And look, we'll say it over and over. Violence is never the answer. This guy gets a trial who's allegedly killed the CEO of United Health. But you can only push people so far. And then they start to take matters into their own hands.
Yeah.
I also cannot help but wonder how this all ties into the trend of nihilism and anti-heroes in modern television and movies. It looks like many people these days love a good story about a disgruntled underachiever or straight up psychopath who wreaks havoc on innocents because they're upset with society or the man or the establishment or some gobbledygook. Breaking Bad's Walter White is considered by many to be an anti-hero. Someone who never got over selling himself short as his former business partners became wealthy and wildly successful in the business world. While Walter White ostensibly turns to crime to pay for his medical bills and secure a safety net for his family, Walter White ultimately has trouble giving up his life of crime, even after making tens of millions of dollars for himself, because being a crystal meth kingpin is the closest thing that Walter White has to reaching his potential as a scientist and a business mogul.
Jesse, you asked me if I was in the meth business or the money business. Neither. I'm in the empire business.
And like the murder of Brian Thompson, Walter White's antics sparked a big debate over healthcare policy in the United States from clueless dorks who are overlooking the bigger picture. So, let's talk about the convoluted mess that is the US healthcare system. Beyond the typical blaming of every and any problem on stuff like greed and profits and capitalism, starting with the alleged Killer's Manifesto, which was published by Ken Klippenstein shortly after the murder of Brian Thompson. One point worth addressing is the scapegoating of the healthcare system for America's low life expectancy rankings. As some have already pointed out, the life expectancy has more to do with Americans being reckless with both their health and overall lives. Whether we like it or not, Americans love to drive fast cars, boats and motorcycles, and choke down gigantic meals, and suck down extreme gulps of soda, and drink ungodly amounts of alcohol, and inhale ungodly amounts of tobacco smoke and marijuana smoke, and shoot loud guns, sometimes doing some or all of these things at the same time. Another thing that jumped out from the manifesto was the mention of someone named Rosenthal as an expert on the healthcare topic, which turned out to be Elizabeth Rosenthal, the author of the book An American Sickness, a book that I have had in my Kindle library for years and have already cited in other videos on the issue of healthcare. But for this video, I decided to go through the entire book again to see if Rosenthal prescribes stuff like murder or terrorism to achieve healthcare reform in the United States. And here's a telling quote I found early on in chapter 12.
Now that you've read about how business stole our healthcare, you know we have the choice to stop it. This is a call to arms.
Oh my God! Alright, just kidding, guys. Here's the full quote.
Now that you've read about how business stole our healthcare, you know we have the choice to stop it. This is a call to arms, as well as a roadmap for us to fight back personally, politically, and systematically. What follows is a blueprint and game plan for changing both our relationship with the medical system and the system itself, sector by sector.
So it looks like the call to arms stuff was just a figure of speech.
Or at least I hope so.
Politically, Rosenthal offers a variety of reforms and alternatives, although she does not take a hard stance on any. Rosenthal also provides a ton of suggestions on how consumers can save money on stuff like healthcare costs and insurance policies, while holding care providers and insurance companies accountable. In other words, you get a sense that Rosenthal has some level of compassion for people who might be getting screwed over by the current healthcare system, and is not out for blood. Not to mention, Rosenthal describes many players in the healthcare industry as being motivated by profit and money, other than just greedy executives, including but not limited to surgeons, specialists, pharmacy benefit managers, coders, medical device salespeople, drug manufacturers, radiologists, conglomerates, universities, hospitals, middlemen. It turns out people like to be paid for a product or service that they provide, while consumers like to pay the least amount of money possible for goods and services. What would be wonderful is if people could figure all of this out on something that's called a free market, where individuals are free to trade with one another without government interference or other types of coercion. Usually, whenever this idea is practiced, we see trends where people get filthy rich by making quality products and services available to the masses at an affordable cost. And I know what some of you might already be thinking, but the US healthcare system is already a free market.
Because when you look at other developed countries, their health insurance systems, they don't have a system like we do where it's for profit, where it's capitalist.
Okay, you expect me to believe that load of crap?
Sure. The US healthcare system is not something resembling a more socialist style system like, say, Denmark or France or Australia or Canada or Sweden or the United Kingdom, but at the same time, the US healthcare system is far from a free market. Even according to An American Sickness and that Delay, Deny, Defend book that's been increasingly talked about, healthcare and insurance are some of the most regulated industries in America. With that said, let's talk about the history of government intervention in healthcare, insurance, and drugs, often in an effort to make such goods and services more affordable, often having undesirable consequences that are then blamed on capitalism or the profit motive. Back in 2021, I published a more in-depth video essay on YouTube about the history of the Food and Drug Administration and its impact on drug prices in the United States. So I'm going to be brief with this part. Around 1906, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which, when it came to drugs, prohibited the trade of adulterated drugs and medicine, and also established the Food and Drug Administration. In 1938, the FDA would be given more authority when Congress passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, mandating that drugs be proven safe before they enter the markets, and that drug makers provide safety instructions for their products. In 1962, the FDA would be given more authority when it was mandated that drugs be proven efficacious before receiving approval from the FDA, which meant more costly testing, which meant both more research and development for new drugs and a stifling of innovation and competition in the market, both of which would have long-term impacts on drug prices in the United States. In the 1980s, Congress would pass the Orphan Drug Act and the Hatch-Waxman Act, both of which would convolute the patent system over drugs and create a variety of perverse incentives for drug makers. Although in some cases, Hatch-Waxman led to lower prices on drugs. It's worth noting that most prescription drugs in the United States are relatively cheap when compared to other countries. According to a report from the Rand Corporation, Americans spend less on generic drugs than their counterparts in other countries, and over 91% of prescriptions in the United States are filled with generic drugs. But of course, we get the occasional viral video of a politician dressing down a pharmaceutical executive because they charge sky-high prices on a particular drug because greed, ignoring the government policies that made the drug expensive in the first place. When I published my video on the FDA, at the time, I did not appreciate the impact that Medicaid and other government programs had on drug prices. Medicaid was passed in 1965 in an effort to provide healthcare coverage for low-income Americans. By 1990, as part of an omnibus budget bill, Congress would introduce the Medicaid Drug Rebate Program, a provision that would require drug makers to fork over generous rebates for drugs purchased under Medicaid, which would end up having an upward impact on list prices for drugs. Basically, when Medicaid buys a drug from a manufacturer, the manufacturer has to give back a rebate to the government, which for brand name drugs is at least 23% of the average manufacturer price. The rebates could be even higher if the difference between the average manufacturer price and the best price, the lowest price available on the market with some exceptions, is greater than 23%. This would lead to drug makers increasing the list prices for drugs to avoid steeper rebates, along with discouraging competition by pricing because companies want to avoid setting a lower best price. And there is a history of companies getting penalized to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars for underpaying their rebates. This trend would be exacerbated when Congress passed the Affordable Care Act, perhaps better known as Obamacare, in 2010, which mandated that insurance companies cover prescription drugs, thereby further roping insurers into the rebates game. Backtracking for a minute, we should also remember that in 2003, Congress passed the Medicare Modernization Act, which expanded prescription drug coverage for seniors, which many claim had an upward impact on drug prices, and at the very least, made Americans increasingly reliant on third-party payers for medicine. Then in 2021, Congress would pass the American Rescue Plan, which modified the Medicaid drug rebate program by scrapping the caps on rebates, meaning that drug companies can now potentially essentially pay the federal government to take drugs off their hands. While this did lead to some massive cuts in drug list prices, notably for insulin, some speculate that getting rid of the rebate caps could potentially lead to higher launch prices for new drugs and increased costs for commercial and Medicare buyers, and a decline in innovation on drugs in the future. Then in 2023, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which would enable Medicare to negotiate prices on certain drugs for seniors. So now we have a situation where it's incredibly expensive and time-consuming to bring new drugs and medicine to market. On top of that, we have a convoluted patent system that, whether intentional or not, has allowed drug makers to exploit the law in effort to crush competition. And on top of that, government policies aimed at making medicine more affordable have made consumers increasingly reliant on third-party payers like insurance companies and government programs, which, along with price controls, have pushed list prices on drugs through the roof, creating powerful middlemen like pharmacy benefit managers along the way to figure out all these different rebates and negotiations between government programs and insurance companies and care providers and nonprofit institutions and drug manufacturers. One group that's rarely, if ever, considered in these negotiations is people who might have to pay partially or entirely out of pocket for their prescription medication. And now is a good time to discuss how healthcare consumers in general have become reliant on third-party payers, and how this trend of third-party payers has impacted pricing mechanisms throughout the industry. Often when people buy stuff, they pay for the stuff with their own money out of pockets. But in the US healthcare system, about 10% of total expenditures are paid out of pockets, which is actually pretty low when compared to the rest of the developed world. About 48% is paid by taxpayers through various government programs, and another 30% is covered by health insurance companies. Of course, Americans' increasing reliance on third-party payers, including health insurance, is much more a result of government intervention rather than the free market. Health insurance started mostly as a hedge against missed work, providing workers with supplementary income if they missed work due to injury or illness. In the first half of the 20th century, Americans started to come around on what were called Blue Cross plans, which were essentially a form of catastrophic health insurance meant to cover lengthy and costly hospital stays. The health insurance market would change during World War II, when the federal government imposed price controls on labor. Employers in the private sector would respond by competing for labor by offering benefits, like health insurance. Then in the early 1950s, the Internal Revenue Service would further incentivize the practice of employers offering health insurance benefits by excluding benefits from income taxes and payroll taxes, an incentive that would be solidified by Congress in 1954, which I guess has its perks. Workers don't have to worry about shopping for health insurance, and employers can save some money. And this did lead to a massive increase in Americans getting health insurance, and also expecting insurance to cover more and more services along the way. Whereas before this, Americans would mostly pay for stuff like doctor visits out of pockets. These days, about 154 million non-elderly Americans rely rely on employer-sponsored health insurance. Some estimate that the cost of a typical employer-sponsored health insurance policy for a family is worth anywhere between $15,000 and $25,000. On the other hand, as Michael Cannon's study for the Cato Institute points out, these tax incentives are fundamentally coercive and have created a variety of undesirable consequences, like depriving workers of choice in the health insurance market and control over their own income, along with making workers reliant on their employers for healthcare coverage, leaving workers vulnerable to losing their health insurance benefits if they lose their job, retire, or simply want to switch careers, which I'm gonna guess became a bit of a problem that politicians thought necessary to solve because by the mid-1960s, Congress and President Lyndon Baines Johnson would introduce Medicare and Medicaid, two massive government programs aimed at providing healthcare coverage to the elderly and the poor. The massive spending increases, along with other expansions of the welfare state, would eventually result in inflation by the 1970s, and as some have pointed out, would immediately have an impact on prices for healthcare. In the long run, these massive programs would make Americans increasingly reliant on third-party payers, which would result in price distortions throughout the industry. This is a trend that David Goldhill stresses in his book Catastrophic Care, and is even echoed at times in books like Overcharged and An American Sickness. And this is not even to mention the impact that Medicare's price controls would have on the market, where care providers make up any lost revenue on Medicare patients by upcharging insurers and out-of-pocket payers. Apparently, this is what a free market healthcare system looks like.
Right now, when we have this no-holds-barred, Wild West hyper-capitalism.
That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, dude.
A system where roughly half of healthcare expenditures are covered by taxpayers, with another 30% covered by private insurance, much of which is provided by employers due to tax incentives, where doctors and hospitals and clinics and other care providers are not sure how in the hell to price their services because they expect to get negotiated down by the who's who of powerful third-party payers, which sometimes is a worst-case scenario, given that in many cases, massive bills end up getting covered in full by deep-pocketed third-party payers. And as Elizabeth Rosenthal points out, the Affordable Care Act, in many cases, incentivizes insurance companies to cover abnormally large bills, whereas David Goldhill's book stresses that the Affordable Care Act did not really make healthcare more affordable, but rather uses a variety of measures in effort to get more Americans covered by health insurance, estimating that the cost of the program would be endured with higher prices on health insurance, an estimation that appears to have since played out. And look, I don't mean to sound all doom and gloom here. In some respects, the American healthcare system still has its benefits and does things better than the rest of the world. And I'm sure a lot of Americans benefit on the surface, from either good insurance plans provided by their employer, or have a solid policy that's heavily subsidized by the taxpayers, or were able to get health insurance thanks to the Affordable Care Act's pre-existing condition mandate. There is certainly no shortage of apologists for stuff like Obamacare, Medicare, Medicaid, the FDA, and other government programs and institutions related to healthcare. But there are definitely problems with the current U.S. healthcare system, and scapegoating the free market is ludicrous, given that the U.S. healthcare system is incredibly regulated and subsidized. This is not to mention some of the more obscure laws and regulatory tweaks to the healthcare system over the last 80 years, along with regulations at the state level. Perhaps a reason why people are quick to blame every and any problem on greed, or or talk about the supposed evils of making a profit is because acknowledging some of the root causes may require these politicians and commentators in the media to rethink a few things. Maybe consider the possibility that some of the policies that these people love so much have ended up making things worse. It could also be as simple as these people not wanting to abandon their goofy-ass code of ethics known as altruism. A major reason why the healthcare system has become increasingly controlled by the government, and a reason why the socialized healthcare advocates keep gaining momentum, is because nobody questions their fundamental moral premise. Americans live in a culture that wants its freedom to make money, get rich, and pursue happiness, but also wants to hold on to altruism, often to the point of imposing altruism on everyone else. The code of ethics that says that the selfless concern for others, particularly the poor, the weak, and the suffering, is the standard for morality. It's altruism that ultimately motivates the existing government intervention policies in the healthcare industry, and motivates the people who want to stamp out whatever vestiges of capitalism still exist.
And at a time when we have 3 people in this country owning more wealth than the bottom half of America, while 500,000 people are sleeping out on the streets today, we think it is time for change, real change.
One discussion that was sparked after the murder of Brian Thompson was the issue of denied claims by health insurance companies, with United Healthcare apparently leading the way in claim denial rates. Many have pointed out that this criticism is unfair, especially considering that nobody credits or celebrates insurance companies for all of the massive claims that they end up covering.
Every penny of the $22 billion in profit made by United Health was made at the expense and suffering of others.
Not to mention, the overall profits of the health insurance industry is a drop in the bucket when compared to overall healthcare expenditures, meaning that if insurance companies decided to work for free, we would probably still read horror stories about denied coverage. Additionally, the healthcare systems that socialists and economic fascists want to emulate also deny claims in effort to save the system money, or patients go without treatment due to longer wait times. But the key difference between a socialist healthcare system denying coverage and a private insurance company in a mixed healthcare system denying coverage is that the socialist healthcare system is not turning a profit when doing so. Profits. And there's a lot more nuance than people like to admit. An American Sickness and other books I've mentioned discuss several cases in which hospitals and doctors prescribe and order unnecessary and expensive tests and procedures and devices, cases in which it might be reasonable for insurance companies to question or deny. Back in 2017, the Department of Justice reported on a racketeering case involving a pharmaceutical company selling fentanyl-based pain medication, and describes how the company attempted to defraud insurance companies who were reluctant to cover suspicious prescriptions. But who knows? Maybe some people would have preferred that the insurance companies turn a blind eye and cover people's fentanyl addictions. Overall, I'm sure there are many cases where people try to get more than they bargained for with their insurance policies, or cases where claims are denied due to a misunderstanding or error, which then get corrected. Not saying that all denied claims are good and fair, but it's a tad bit ridiculous for people to throw around these charts and big numbers, talking as if health insurance executives are like the $1 million man, Ted DiBiase, just sitting at a laptop, denying everyone's claims so that they can rake in the cash. The socialists who want a socialist-style healthcare system in the United States fundamentally think that nobody should profit off of stuff like healthcare and medicine. In fact, socialists don't think that anybody should profit off of anything at all.
No offense, but it sounds like some fucking commie gobbledygook.
And a lot of their fellow travelers, whether it be the so-called progressives or bleeding heart liberals, often go along with this chicanery when it comes to healthcare, declaring stuff like doctor visits and prescription medication and hospital beds and medical treatments as a human rights.
Healthcare, in my view, is a human right.
Hoping that nobody raises questions like, if I as a human have a right to someone else's labor and someone else's money and someone else's stuff, does that mean that other people have a right to my labor and my money and my stuff? Wouldn't that mean that I don't have the right to the fruits of my labor? Or the right to keep my money? Or the right to keep my stuff? If that's the case, am I really free?
No, of course not.
The loudest advocates for healthcare reform right now are self-proclaimed socialists like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, pushing for a program that they call Medicare for All, which, judging by Bernie's antics over the years, he intends to impose high taxes on all Americans, along with aggressive price controls throughout the healthcare industry. I get this impression because back in 2018, Bernie Sanders famously thanked the Koch brothers for funding a study that estimated that Medicare for All would cost less than the current healthcare system. What Bernie Sanders leaves out is that the $3.2 trillion in added costs he's running with is a best case scenario estimation, with the report mentioning that the figure is likely to be an underestimation. The author of the report even responded by writing a piece in the Wall Street Journal, stressing that the program is likely to cost more money than what Bernie Sanders is telling everybody, and to achieve such a low figure would require aggressive price controls on care providers and products, with the author adding that it's impossible to estimate potential consequences, like the availability of healthcare potentially shrinking, because healthcare professionals might decide that the juice is not worth the squeeze under Medicare for All, and that hospitals and clinics could lose a lot of money, along with potential innovation losses in the drug market.
So you're going to pay a little bit more in taxes.
And that doubling both income taxes and corporate taxes,
so you're going to pay a little bit more in taxes,
would not be enough to finance Medicare for All, even at the lowest estimation.
So you're going to pay a little bit more in taxes.
So assuming that Bernie Sanders read the study and the author's response, he does intend to tell healthcare professionals and drug makers how much money they're allowed to make, while also telling Americans how much money they're allowed to keep from their paychecks.
That's un-American.
Meaning that Bernie Sanders wants to chip away at freedom in the country, while making everyone poorer in the process. Now the study is 7 years old, and Bernie Sanders pretty much peaked politically after losing another presidential election in 2020. So maybe this is all old news and dated information, but it is worth noting how brazen Bernie Sanders is with his desire to tell everyone what to do with their money. And Bernie is already in the process of passing the torch to a younger, charismatic socialist who shares his desires. And they justify this insanity because they think that sacrifice for some noble cause is the standard for morality, going as far to make everyone sacrifice for their noble cause. And it also helps that the healthcare system is a convoluted mess with a variety of problems that's difficult for most people to understand. So socialist knuckleheads can just say, greed, grrr, and hope that everyone will just go along with their crusade against greed. What the US healthcare system needs is freedom. Let people trade their goods and services with one another for their own self-interest. The government can do stuff like enforce contracts and punish those in the industry who engage in stuff like fraud and negligence, and that's about it. It's interesting how products like computers, and televisions and video games have improved dramatically in quality over the decades, as they have all also become more affordable for consumers, all while the makers of these products make ungodly amounts of money. This trend must be baffling to politicians who like to declare things a human rights before using political power in effort to make these products more affordable. Meanwhile, politicians have been trying to make healthcare more affordable for the better part of a century, and yet prices for healthcare and medicine are all out of whack. It's time that politicians let people on the free market dictate prices for stuff like healthcare, medicine, and insurance, and let consumers make decisions for themselves. But this probably won't happen until Americans give up on a moral code that establishes sacrifice as the standard for good. Right now, the political system in America is dominated by two major political parties. One of the parties, the Democrats, has in general been a force for increasing the government's role in the economy ever since the progressive era. And since at least the New Deal era, Democrats have tried numerous times during every Democrat administration to pass some sort of national health insurance policy or single-payer healthcare system, or some piecemeal legislation that provided healthcare coverage for certain groups. My friend Stephen Michael Davis gave a rundown of this history in a video he published 5 years ago, and such details are mentioned at times in David Goldhill's book. Whether or not Democrats rally behind a socialist goof like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or someone more moderate, is yet to be seen. But I doubt there's any Democrats right now with presidential ambitions who thinks that the healthcare system needs a little more capitalism, much less a lot more capitalism. On the other hand, there's the Republicans, currently headed by President Donald Trump and his Make America Great Again movement, which I guess is also all about Make America Healthy Again, pursuing some of the same stuff on the federal level that Democrats have been trying at the state level in California. That's right, folks. The same constituency that complained about Michelle Obama's school lunches and mocked Mayor Mike Bloomberg's sugar drink regulations now want to use the power of government to make Americans healthy. Donald Trump and his cheerleaders also shrieked and shrilled about the prospect of a President Kamala Harris imposing communist price controls. And now President Trump is trying to impose price controls on drugs by executive order. Not to mention President Trump appointing a Democrat like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. This is to say nothing about the history of Republicans inching the healthcare system in the direction that it currently is, and on their best days being absolutely pathetic in passing or advocating for any free market reforms. President Richard Nixon supported the idea of imposing health insurance mandates back in the 1970s. By 1993, soon-to-be Republican Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich voiced support for requiring that Americans have health insurance. The Medicaid drug rebate program was signed into law by Republican President George Herbert Walker Bush. The Medicare Modernization Act was signed into law by Republican President George W. Bush. That's my Bush. And of course, there's the infamous case of Mitt Romney, who with the help of the Heritage Foundation passed Obamacare-like legislation while he was the governor of Massachusetts, before going on to lose to Barack Obama in the 2012 presidential election. After Obamacare was passed, Republicans campaigned for years on repealing the law. And once Republicans acquired the executive branch and legislative branch by 2017, the best Republicans could do was some middle-of-the-road repeal that ultimately failed to pass the Senate because of Barack Obama's 2008 opponent, Senator John McCain. And these days, the Republicans are indistinguishable from Bernie Sanders at times, and overall are in the same ballpark as Elizabeth Warren when it comes to economic policy. There's also the fact that this much government involvement in healthcare makes it much easier for Republicans to battle culture war issues, using the state to prevent or make it more difficult for people to get abortions and sex change operations. So, unfortunately, it looks like neither major political party is interested in reforming the healthcare system toward a free market. But who knows? Maybe entrepreneurs, particularly those in the tech industry, will find ways to overcome government regulations to make healthcare better and more affordable. Stuff like this has happened before. And I'm sure when that happens, politicians will froth at the mouth to declare any new inventions or products a human right.
Human rights.
And with the healthcare topic out of the way, now might be a good time for Americans to take the issue of political violence and the cultural support for it more seriously. And I know it's not like political violence is new in America, but I'm not sure how much good can come from inspiring other lunatics out there. People who might feel that the best way to find a meaning in life is to kill and terrorize people that they think deserve it. And I'm sure all the people out there cheering on the murder of Brian Thompson would not appreciate it much if they or someone they care about were on the receiving end of such violence. Perhaps demonstrated by some people's conflicting attitudes toward the murder of a health insurance executive versus the murder of Democrat politicians in Minnesota.
You absolutely suck!
On top of that, this could all potentially discourage decent and good people from pursuing important work, like leading a company or running for political office. Furthermore, in many cases, political violence is used by politicians as a justification to pass new laws that might erode and chip away at certain liberties, and in extreme cases, is used by authoritarians to grab power for themselves, all in the name of law and order or maintaining the peace. The bottom line is, the buffoons who cheer on terrorism and political violence, whether they know it or not, are essentially rooting for their own and everyone else's destruction.